think no more. All right. So we continue our discussion on Wojtyła's philosophy. We are still under the topic subjectivity, the subjectivity of the human person. So now hopefully I can finish my discussion on subjectivity and then proceed to human action. So in this discussion, I focus on the development of the notion of the subjectivity of the human person. And Wojtyła somehow traces the development of the understanding of the subjectivity of the human person from the medieval age, from medieval philosophy, by way of Aquinas, and then how it developed during the modern era by way of the philosophy of René Descartes. And this is what he called the two views on the subjectivity of the human person. How the notion of subjectivity was developed from the philosophy of being of Aristotle and Aquinas, and the philosophy of consciousness of René Descartes. So that's philosophy of being from Aquinas and Aristotle during the medieval times, and a philosophy of consciousness in the philosophy of Descartes. So during the Middle Ages, or medieval ages, philosophy was, as we know, it was predominantly Aristotelian, and it was interpreted by St. Thomas Aquinas. And according to Wojtyła, the focus of philosophy during the time was on philosophy of being. Okay, the philosophy. So more or less, the philosophy of the medieval age, especially of Aquinas, was more focused on metaphysics. And that metaphysics is actually a Christian metaphysics. It explains reality in terms of, or in accordance with the Christian belief. Okay, the Christian belief in a God, in one God. Okay, so it's God who authored reality. So if you want to explain how reality is, then you have to include the theology of the medieval ages. Now, during the modern era, as we know, the modern era was ushered in by Renaissance, and one of those who revolutionized, and that's why he's called the father of modern philosophy, René Descartes, introduced the philosophy of consciousness. And here, according to Wojtyła, according to this reading, and of course this is also the reading of many historians of philosophy, that the modern era, the philosophy of modern era, is more predominantly rationalistic and empirical. Of course, we refer to this as the empiricism of the modern philosophy and the rationalism of modern philosophy. But of course, the focus was more on the human faculties of reason and senses. And the focus, of course, of the modern philosophers will be divided into two different directions, especially in trying to explain the foundation and nature of knowledge. One saying that the foundation of knowledge is reason, that's the rationalist, and on the other side, you have the empiricist saying that the foundation of knowledge is the sense, or the senses. So according to Wojtyła, this resulted in two perspectives. One focused on being, and the second is focused on the human faculties. Okay? And here, you're going to see that if you're going to push the question about difference between being and the human person, you're going to see two different metaphysics or two different ontologies. Okay? So you have metaphysics of being, which is more or less metaphysics of substance, and the other kind of metaphysics that focus on a kind of humanism, on the faculties of the human person. So, Wojtyła characterized this fissure as a division between philosophy of being and philosophy of consciousness, or philosophy of the human person. So, this philosophy of being, of course, as we have mentioned, is characteristic of Aristotle and Aquinas, from the ancient to the medieval, and then the philosophy of consciousness, characteristic of the philosophy of Descartes. And based on this, according to Wojtyła, that started the demarcation between these two different views of subjectivity. So, during the medieval times, of course, there's a uniform view of subjectivity of the human person. Of course, they are not yet using the word subjectivity, because subjectivity will be introduced by the modern thinkers, especially by the contemporary thinkers. They were using the term substance, okay? Substantiva. And at the beginning of the modern era, you have now this demarcation between two different views of subjectivity, the beginning of the modern era. So, what is the difference between these two views about human person, or the subjectivity of the human person? First, in the Aristotelian tradition, and developed later by St. Thomas Aquinas, man is considered as a natural thing alongside other natural things. The definition of man as a rational animal puts man in the same category as the animals, as the natural things. What differentiates man from the other natural things? That man has reason. So reason is in the definition, that's the specific difference. Now, if you go back to your logic, so you have the genera, the genus, animal, and the specific difference, rational. Okay? So, this definition, according to Wojtyla, fulfills Aristotle's requirements for defining the species, meaning the human being, through its proximate genus, a living being, an anima, and the feature that distinguishes the given species in that genus that is endowed with reason. So you have the genera as an animal or an animated being, and the specific difference, reason or rational. This definition, however, according to Wojtyla, excludes the possibility of emphasizing the irreducible in man. Later on, we're going to talk about the irreducibility, but in general, it simply means that you cannot reduce man to any particular category, because man is a unique being. Even if you call him an animal, his animality is different from the animals. Okay? Precisely because of the personal nature, the personalistic nature of man. So, it implies rather the reducibility of man to the world, what we would call a cosmological reduction. So, with this definition, man is reduced to the level of the cosmos. He's just one of the many natural beings, albeit living in the natural world. Okay? Of course, because people might ask, and what is wrong with that? Okay? But for Wojtyla, that's a different kind of metaphysics, because it does not emphasize the very personal nature of man, that man cannot be reduced to the level of the animals. Okay? So it views man from the point of view of the cosmos as a whole. It sees man as reducible to the level of the cosmos of the world. Now, of course, Wojtyla is always, he tries to emphasize, or he tries to point out both the positive and the negative view in a particular philosophy. So while he was critical of the philosophy of Aristotle and Aquinas at some point, he also compliments them for their contribution. So he's doing a certain sort of a balancing between, two different, just one philosophy but two different positions. You can view Aristotle and Aquinas' philosophy from this perspective. It will give you a good view of their philosophy, but from another perspective, it might not be a very good understanding of the human person. So that's what he normally does. Just like doing a la Thomas Aquinas, who points out the positive and the negative in every particular point of view. Okay? So, such definition is significant in the development of our view of man. It was the dominant view in the metaphysical anthropology, and the sciences also understand man as a rational animal, okay, endowed with reason. Thus, the pre-modern or pre-Christian tradition focuses on the externally existing being of natural things and of man himself, and is also some sort of a natural thing. Right? So, for Wojtyla, it satisfies the intention of Aristotle to put all beings in a category, okay, into some sort of a classification. Okay. Now, on the part of Descartes, he initiated a turn in philosophy towards the inner self. So while the Thomistic Aristotelian tradition focuses on the external thing, okay, that externally, although he refers to reason, externally man is just the same as the other beings in the world. Descartes, on the other hand, focuses on the inner aspect of man, particularly his consciousness. Right? Now, of course, this is the first time we're going to hear consciousness in philosophy, because before Descartes, you will not hear the word or the concept consciousness from ancient up to the medieval times. Okay? Because the focus, again, of the ancient and medieval is to simply look at man as one of the many. Special, but still one of the many. But Descartes, he initiated or he revolutionized how we view man, because he focused on what is inside, what is inner. Okay? Of course, you can say that the faculties of reason and will is also inner, but that's not the inner that Descartes is talking about. Okay? The inner life that Descartes is talking about is his consciousness. And this is the very first time in philosophy that consciousness has been discussed in philosophy. Okay? Of course, if you're going to trace the development, how philosophy evolved and separated from the other sciences, for example, in psychology. Psychologists they were already talking about, of course, psychology is part of science, they were already talking about the consciousness, the mind. The mind, not reason, but the mind as, as something inner. Okay. So, initiated a turn in philosophy which focuses on the inner self, that is the self-subjective awareness of its cognitive acts. The self-subjective awareness of its cognitive act. Okay. So, the difference is this. Aristotle considers man as an object, and he sees in this object, in man, two faculties, intellect and will. Okay? But it is an approach, it is an objective approach. It's an approach where the investigator is separated from the object of his investigation. The philosopher is looking at man as an object of analysis. Descartes, on the other hand, his approach is different, because it is now the subject looking into himself. He's not looking at an external being outside of himself. The philosopher, Descartes in this case, is not looking at a particular human being and trying to analyze him. He's actually looking inside, looking into his own self, and see what are these cognitive acts. Of course, he's going to see the same thing. He's going to see reason and will, but it's a different approach, because it's a more of an introspective approach. Of course, that's not something unique. He's not the one who initiated that, because back to the time of St. Augustine, when he wrote the Confession, was already doing an introspection, looking into his own self. Okay? But in Descartes, it is more pronounced because he's focusing on his consciousness, on his cognitive act. He's not focusing on his past life, like what St. Augustine did. Okay? Introspection, looking into his past life, before his conversion and then after his conversion. That's a different thing. That's a different kind of investigation. What Descartes is doing now is to look into his own self. But of course, he did that through his philosophical meditations. You read the first meditation, and that's exactly what he's doing. Okay? Doubting all his, first doubting his existence, doubting his perception. But of course, the ultimate goal of Descartes is to establish the indubitable. And he found the indubitable in cognition. So, He wanted to establish philosophy in an unshakable ground and starts philosophizing about himself and God on the individual. And for him, the individual is the cogito. Okay? And of course, he did this by way of his methodic doubt. Okay? We'll not focus on the methodic doubt anymore. No? That's a long story. So, the approach of Descartes is different from the approach of the medieval philosophers Aquinas and Aristotle, because Aristotle and Aquinas are looking at man objectively. That's why he will call this objective philosophy, or the objectification of the subjectivity of the human person. Descartes, on the other hand, is not looking at man objectively, he's actually doing it subjectively. Subjectively in the sense that he's looking into himself. He's not looking at one man and trying to investigate this man and he has reason and will. No, he looks at himself. Of course, he sees the same thing, but he focuses more on consciousness, on the thinking being. Okay? But according to Wojtyla, this cogito of Descartes caused the split of the human being into two separate and independent principles or components, namely the body as a res extensa or extended being, and the res cogitans. So now Descartes has the problem. So he sees that what defines man, or one of the components of man, the inner man, it points to the cogito. Okay, it points to the cogito. So the cogito is a thinking substance. And as a thinking substance, it is spiritual, it is mental, and it is different from the res extensa, the body. And Descartes initiated this dualistic view of man, that man is composed of two different substances, the body, which is the res extensa, and the mind, capable of the cogito, which is a res cogitans. Okay? So, it's a kind of dualism. Of course, that Cartesian dualism will cause lots of problems for the succeeding rationalists. It will cause problems for Spinoza, and cause problems for Leibniz, and it will cause problems for Malebranche. And all these rationalist philosophers following Descartes will try to be creative in order to explain or reconcile this dualism of Descartes. Okay? The funny thing about it is that Descartes pointed at the pineal gland as a point of interaction between the res cogitans, between the mind and the body. And the pineal gland, of course, is part of the body. So does it mean that the mind enters into the body in order to converse with the body? So that puts him in a lot of, very delicate position. Anyway, but having said that, he has caused this dualism. Although these principles are related to one another in a parallel way, they are never regarded as one undivided substantial compositum humanum. In other words, Descartes never considered man as an individual substance, as a unified substance. Okay? So, he will always consider this as two parallel. Well, the term that we use to describe this is exaggerated dualism. An exaggerated type of dualism. Okay? And again, as I've said, that will cause lots of problem for the... So, this substantial human composite follows, of course, the tradition set by Aquinas and Aristotle, because man, for them, is composed of matter and form. Okay? Matter and the substantial form. Although they are separate, but they are incomplete in themselves. Each one needs the other in order to complete the human person. So the human person is one substance composed of two different faculties. But the body and the mind, for Aquinas, are not two separate substances. A person is one substance composed of these two principles. No? What in Philosophy psychology is called the determining principle and the indeterminate principle. Okay? The vital principle and of course the material principle. All right. So the Cartesian dualism started the gradual development in philosophy of what Wojtyla would call the hypostasization of consciousness. Hypostasization, which means that gradually he develops consciousness into a separate being. Okay? Consciousness now becomes a separate being. Right? So, of course, for Descartes, consciousness is part of the human person. But later on, it will develop into a separate subject, into a separate being. Okay? A consciousness in itself. And that's the one thing that Wojtyla does not like, because there's no such thing as consciousness in itself, because that consciousness is always part of the human person. Okay? It's not a separate entity. So consciousness became an independent subject of activity and indirectly of existence, occurring somehow alongside the body. So consciousness is a different entity alongside the body. And Descartes used to describe the relationship between the body and the mind or consciousness. The term of this video is interaction. There's just an interaction between the two. Interaction is different from substantial union. Because for them to interact, that means there are two separate, complete substances interacting. Okay? But the understanding of Wojtyla, by way of finance, is that they are not separate entities, they are just two principles in one substance. Okay? Well, the followers of Descartes, as I already mentioned, Spinoza and Leibniz, and they will have their own different interpretation or explanations for this dualism. Leibniz will call it psychological parallelism, meaning imagine the two clocks, put them side by side, but they are synchronized. Okay? So they tell time the same, but they are two different clocks. That's psychophysical parallelism. Okay? So meaning the body and the mind are not really totally interacting, they are just synchronized. But of course that creates more problem, because how do you explain my stream of thought and my body movement? Right? Or for example, when you think of something very scary and then you perspire, it cannot just be some kind of a synchrony. See? Alright, so the body being a material structure or component is subject to the deterministic laws of nature. And the hypostasization of consciousness led to the identification of the person and consciousness. So now, consciousness or the mind, as understood in other philosophies, mind is just a component of the person. Now, the mind or consciousness is now the person. Okay? It's now identified with the person is a cogito. Of course, some other philosophers would be happy to oblige, will agree with that. But there is more to man than consciousness. There is more to man than the mind. Okay? While Descartes recognized the body and the mind, he actually put more importance, more weight to the cogito than the body. Okay? And then eventually, just defining man, later philosophers will just identify the person as consciousness, or man as cogito. Right? Of course, what was it? Levinas or Ricard, who was the wounded cogito? Ricard. I'm not mistaken. The wounded cogito. That's recurred. Okay, that's recurred. Okay. Okay. But some philosophers, contemporary philosophers, are not, what do you call this? They are quite hard in their criticism of Descartes. Okay? Contemporary philosophers, when they try to make their own point, they will refer back to Descartes and the lapses of Descartes, the limitations of Descartes. I sat in one panel, in one defense, and I don't know if I sounded like an apologist of Descartes. Because I said, well, you have to understand that Descartes did not have the benefit of another Descartes before him. These philosophers, like for example Ricoeur, had the benefit of Descartes. In other words, like Schiller had the benefit of Kant. He had Kant to step on and then trample Kant and then develop his own philosophy. Descartes, I don't know if Descartes has some sort of a Descartes before him, who he can critique and then establish his own philosophy. Can you think of a philosopher that Descartes used in order to establish his own philosophy? He was doing something very trailblazing, very pioneering in his meditation. But anyway, I'm not lawyering for Descartes. But just to put that in perspective, that he's making a philosophy, and the intention of Descartes in his philosophy is not really to talk about the human person. He's trying to establish philosophy, at least epistemologically, on solid foundation. And that's where he arrived. He arrived at the cogito. All right. So for Descartes, the person is primarily, if not exclusively, a consciousness that is in some way subsistent and existing against the background of the organism, which Descartes regarded as a special kind of mechanism. The body has a special kind of mechanism because the body is subject to the deterministic laws of nature. The body is subject to the deterministic laws of nature. Because the body is something that is material, that understanding of the body as something material and mechanical actually came from Thomas Hobbes. Okay? Thomas Hobbes understood everything to be material, to be mechanical. Material, mechanical, and therefore subject to the laws of nature, the physical laws. And since the body is part of the physical world of nature, then it is also subject to the laws of nature. And therefore, it will always be deterministic. So that's why he calls it a special kind of mechanism. Especially because the body, although physical, is different from the other physical things. Okay? So this chair and my body are both res extensa, but the res extensa of the body is different from this chair being res extensa. It's a special kind of res extensa because it has its own biological functions. But just the same, it is determined by natural laws. You eat, and deterministically, the food that you take will be digested, and then it will be eliminated by the body. Okay? So without the consent of the will. So when you eat something, you cannot will that it will not be digested, or it will be digested differently by your stomach. It will be digested by the stomach, the way the stomach digests the food. Okay? So that's the reason, that's the explanation for that. This special kind of mechanism. So while consciousness is an object of inner experience, of introspection, the body, like any other material object in the natural world, is accessible through observation and external experience. Right? Now, of course, that still holds true. It is accessible through observation and external experience. But for Wojtyla, the human body is not just an ordinary body. The soma is not just any kind of body, because this is the body of the human person. And because it's the body of the human person, again, I'm going to use the term personalistic body, because it's the body of the human person. So if you happen to be a doctor, you have to respect the body of your patient, because it's not just any body. All right, of course, it's not only Wojtyla say that. You study Marcel, and that's what exactly Marcel would say, that the body, the human body, is a different body. So, Wojtyla nevertheless acknowledges the contributions of the Cartesian standpoint. Like the Aristotelian tradition, there is something positive in the Cartesian, because from this conception of man, from this conception of consciousness, we now regard man as irreducible because of his consciousness, or because of his conscious cognitive states. So that breaks us from the Aristotelian understanding of man as simply a rational animal. Okay? So that breaks us from the objective understanding of man. Because now at least we can say, well, because of consciousness, and that consciousness cannot be found in any other being, therefore man is irreducible to the level of the cosmos. Okay? So for that, he commends the Cartesian tradition. So what Descartes and the subsequent philosophers discovered is the subjectivity, or the interiority of the human person, the core of the conscious subject. And according to Wojtyla, it is man as a conscious subject, or as consciousness, that becomes the focus of distinctly post-Cartesian philosophy. So Descartes initiated that analysis of consciousness, and after Descartes, succeeding philosophers will focus on this consciousness. Okay? This conscious subject. Okay? So, of course, there's a difference between a rational subject and a conscious subject. Aristotle and Aquinas focused on the rational aspect of man. Descartes, on the other hand, and then the post-Cartesian philosophers focused on consciousness. And it was actually consciousness that made man aware of his inner life, not reason. For Wojtyla, it was consciousness that made man aware of his faculties. Well, for Aquinas, we just use reason. Maybe indirectly we are conscious of our reasoning or rational capacities, but it was never emphasized in the philosophy of Aristotle and Aquinas. So one important contribution of Descartes to philosophy, or to philosophical anthropology, is the recognition of consciousness, which allows man to be conscious of his cognitive states, or his cognitive acts, including his will and reason. Okay? That's one very big contribution to philosophical anthropology. All right, so now let's focus on the modern post-Cartesian view of the person, because now it proceeds to develop through an analysis of consciousness, particularly self-consciousness. So now there's now another thing. Descartes developed the idea of consciousness, and then the post-Cartesian philosophers another dimension to this analysis of consciousness, and that is self-consciousness. That the self is conscious of its own consciousness. Okay? So it's different from you say, I'm conscious of my cognitive act. Meant to say that I am aware of my consciousness. I am aware now of what my consciousness can do. And that's where you can now connect to the idea of Husserl about consciousness is always consciousness of something, and that something could be the self. Okay? So now we can study consciousness, and Wojtyla will actually expand his analysis of consciousness. And he will be actually talking about the two functions of consciousness. Okay? The reflexive and the, you haven't reached that part yet in your readings. What? There are two functions of consciousness.
Mirroring.
The mirroring, which is the reflective, and the other one is the
Interior.
reflexive. Reflective, reflexive. Okay? Anyway, you have to read faster. Okay? And again, reminder, by the way, that the submission of your first paper will be next week. Alright? So summary of the first chapter. Okay? And then 2 weeks after, another paper, the next chapter. Okay? So every 2 weeks you will have to submit. How many chapter was that? Is that the person? These are 5, I think 5 chapters, so that means in 10 weeks you must have finished reading the active person. How many chapters? 4? 5. 5 chapters. 7 chapters, or I'm referring to the parts. 4 parts. Okay. Anyway, I will. So the next summary, I will. Because some parts are very long, no? So ikakat natin yan. Okay. So I will divide it into 5. Para you have 5 times 2. That's 10 weeks. No, it's 10 weeks. How many months? 2.5 months. Okay. So in 2.5 months, you have finished reading that in person, and then after that, we focus on love and responsibility. Okay.
For next week, we have to make a summary of chapter 1 or part 1?
I think I gave you the. I think that's part 1.
Part 1 has 2 chapters.
I included. I include up to the part on subjectivity. Yeah. I think it's only chapter 1 to part 1. Okay. All right. All right. So we do it little steps, no? And then next time, two parts or 2 chapters. Okay. Anyway. All right. So alongside consciousness, freedom. We're talking of the post-Cartesian. Okay. By post-Cartesian we mean. Actually, the post-Cartesian would refer to the contemporary philosophers, okay, the existentialists and the phenomenologists, because they are the ones who focus on subjectivity. So, alongside consciousness, freedom is also emphasized, which is interpreted as total independence. Freedom becomes total independence because if consciousness is independent, and part of consciousness would be freedom, it's also total independence. Consequently, the Aristotelian and Thomistic notion of freedom as property of the person and an attribute of the will, like in the free will, it disappears from this subjectivistic view of the human person. Okay? And for Wojtyla, that is rather problematic. Okay? Because now you separate freedom from the subjective, from the interior elements of the person, or part of the as part or property of the human person. So, the subjective elements of the person, namely freedom, lived experience, and consciousness, as a permanent component of lived experience, are absolutized. Okay. There comes a point when the person is no longer treated as a substance, but a certain property of lived experiences, and can be distinguished by means of those experiences, for they are conscious and self-conscious experiences. In fact, when you read or when you study Max Scheler has this notion of the person as the totality of acts. the human person is the totality of all his acts. If man is the totality of all his acts, where is now the substance? A person is a substance. In the Boethian definition, and of course Aquinas' definition, the person is a substance. Okay? A substance, a rational substance, an individual substance of a rational nature. There's always the substance. But in Max Scheler, man becomes the totality of his actions. That is somehow similar to the understanding of process philosophers about the person. And there are other philosophies who have the same position as, is there a center, is there a core for the person, or the person is a constantly, continually changing, evolving entity. It's even difficult to say it's an entity, because there is always, in an entity, there's always something that persists or subsists. But when you define person as the totality of the actions or the totality of the processes of his life, it's like David Hume saying that reality is nothing but the succession of appearances. There's nothing that is, underlying. Well, good for Locke, because he recognized that there is a substance, although he cannot understand what the substance is, but still he possesses a substance. But when you absolutize this, these things, then the person, the substance, is totally taken out of the picture. Okay? And it's difficult to imagine how a person can be a person if he's just the totality of all his activities, of all his actions. There must be something there which is responsible for all the actions. Okay? Anyway, so Wojtyla points out that the person acts consciously because the person is a rational being. He's still a being with reason, and because of his reason, he is able to perform these acts consciously. So self-consciousness in turn is connected with freedom, which is actualized in the activity of the will. Freedom is actualized through the activity of the will. So there is the person, and then there are the rational faculties of intellect and will, or reason and will. And then when the will acts, it acts freely. And that's where you connect or you establish freedom. Freedom is the free volition of the will. So, if you understand freedom in that sense, in that way, then freedom is not an absolute separate entity. It is always part of the human person. And where do you trace the connection of freedom to the human person? The will. And will is one of the rational faculties of man. Freedom is never a separate entity. It's never an absolute, separate absolute entity. In the same manner that the consciousness is not a separate entity. There's no such thing as a consciousness in itself. Consciousness is always part of the human person. It's an aspect, an essential aspect of the human person. So, while he appreciates the Cartesian emphasis on the interiority and subjectivity of the person and consciousness, he is critical of the post-Cartesian absolutization of the subjective element of the human person, namely self-consciousness or consciousness and freedom. These rational subjective elements cannot be absolutized. Absolutized meaning you cannot take them out of the person and create a separate entity out of them, because these are always part of the human person. So, Wojtyla explains that the Thomistic view of the person is an objective interpretation of man, which puts emphasis on the fact that the person is a distinct subject of existence and activity. So, for Wojtyla, so he agrees with Thomas Aquinas that the person is a subject. It is a subject that exists in itself, and as a subject, it has its own activity or activities. One of them would be the rational activity, which we can distinguish between the rational activity and the volitional activity of the will. Okay? So, the person's nature is rational, and that makes him capable of consciousness and self-consciousness. So again, for Wojtyla, these are all integrated into the person. They are all parts, essential parts of the human person. Okay. Any questions so far? Clear? Okay. All right. Now, while we recognize, as I said, while we recognize the positive contributions of these two traditions, he was also conscious of the limitations and the errors of these two traditions. Right? So he points out the limitation of the interpretation of, of the Thomistic as far as analyzing more deeply consciousness and self-consciousness. So, Wojtyla commends the philosophy grounded on being, that's the philosophy of Aquinas and Aristotle, for its ability to grasp and affirm all that shows itself in the human intellect. Okay? Reason and will. The philosophy grounded on being sees the human person as a determinate existing being in all the inexhaustible richness of its contents. However, according to Wojtyla, while St. Thomas provided an excellent view of the objective existence and activity of the person, it would be difficult to speak in this view, in the view of St. Thomas, of the lived experiences of the person. And that is, for Wojtyla, the limitation of Thomistic philosophy, or this philosophy of being. It cannot be used, the philosophy of being of Aquinas and Aristotle cannot be used in order to emphasize the lived experience of the person. And the lived experience of the person is what makes the person unique because of his own lived experiences. It is what makes a person unrepeatable because of his personal lived experiences. And for Wojtyla, that is one limitation of Thomistic philosophy. Because Thomistic philosophy focuses on the objective, on what is common to all. It does not focus on what is unique to each and every person. Of course, the person is unique from all the other beings in the world, from the cosmological level, but although we are unique, generally, personally, of course, we are common to all, but personally we are still unique, because what I'll share with you, the rational nature of all men, my lived experience will be different from you and from everybody. Everyone will have a different personal, and that makes the human person unique because each person has its own lived experience. Right? Even some of you are priest, the being, the lived experience of one priest is different from the lived experience of another priest. While a married man would have the same marital status, they're going to have different lived experiences as husbands and as fathers. And that's the limitation of Thomas or Aquinas' philosophy. It cannot be used to emphasize that lived experience. Okay. So, although the Aristotelian definition of man and the subsequent interpretation of Aquinas was important, this philosophical tradition, which defines man as a rational animal, the human being is reduced simply as an object. Right? He is reduced as an object. Man is just one of the objects in the world, and the human being is not really regarded primarily as a subject. Now, of course, The term subject here is different now from our term substance. Okay? It's a substance, but it cannot, it's a substance, so we appreciate Aristotle and Aquinas for saying that man is a substance, but it's not enough to simply say that man is a substance. Man is a subject, but that's the limitation of Aquinas, because his philosophy of being regards man just an object, not as a subject. And for that, that's the limitation of the Aquinas or the Aristotelian tradition. And for him, that limitation is somehow complemented by the idea of consciousness of Descartes. Because Descartes allowed us to recognize man as a subject. So you see, what Wojtyla does in his philosophy is to get this and then see how he can use this concept in order to understand the human person, and then get some elements from other philosophers, but somehow discuss what he thought to be the dangers or the downsides of this philosophy. Okay, so this is objectivity in this sense was connected with the general assumption of the reducibility of the human being. Subjectivity, on the other hand, is, as it were, a term proclaiming that the human being's proper essence cannot be totally reduced to and explained by the proximate genus and the specific difference, meaning the Aristotelian specific genus and specific difference. Subjectivity is then a kind of synonym for the irreducible in the human being. Okay? So, what is irreducible in man is his very subjectivity. So, the human person has primordial uniqueness, which makes him irreducible to the level of the natural world. Okay? This is the basis of understanding of the human person or the human being as a person. A person has a subjectivity. And because of that subjectivity, he is irreducible to the cosmological level. So if Aristotle reduced man to the cosmological level, what Wojtyla did was to use Descartes in order to raise the subjectivity of the human person. The understanding of the human subject or the human person and the subjectivity and inwardness of the person as a fundamentally positive development in the philosophy, in philosophy. Meaning, for Wojtyla, he recognized this as a fundamental, essential development in the philosophy of the human person. So here, Wojtyla credited the Aristotelian philosophy of being and the Cartesian philosophy of consciousness as essential in the development of a comprehensive philosophical anthropology and ethics. Both are indispensable to an anthropology and axiology that could confront and answer the question about the human person. Both, however, comes with their own respective downside. There is the limitation of being, as we have already explained about, that it cannot be used to, explain or analyze the subjectivity of the human person. And on the side of the philosophy of consciousness, there is always the danger of subjectivism. Because the philosophy of consciousness focuses on subjectivity, according to Wojtyla, there's always the danger of going to the extreme of objectivism. So, there is the danger of objectivism, or the limitation of objectivism, and there is the excess of subjectivism. So, the philosophy of consciousness could lead to subjectivism. It could amount to hypostasizing consciousness and making it a subject all by itself without grounding it in anything. Again, for example, what I already mentioned about what Shell would call that man is just the totality of all these actions. And there's nothing behind or nothing below it to sustain it. Okay? So it could lead to absolutizing consciousness. So to avoid the errors of subjectivism, and of course come up with a limit to the meaning to address the limitation of objectivism, Wojtyla looked for the right approach and method, and he found it in the philosophy of phenomenology. The funny thing is that it was phenomenology who absolutized consciousness, but it was also in phenomenology that he found the right approach to, to avoid the errors of subjectivism. Okay, it was phenomenology that initiated this subjectivism or caused this subjectivism, but it was also in phenomenology that Wojtyla found the right approach to fight subjectivism, okay, or to avoid subjectivism. Okay. All right, so to avoid it was Husserl who presented this idea of consciousness. Well, the first part of Husserl's philosophy, when he was still developing his phenomenological method, he still considered philosophy to be consciousness to be a part of the human subject. But later in his writings, he tried to talk about transcendental ego, and that's where the problems arise. When we talk of the transcendental ego, meaning an ego that is different from the subjective ego. Okay. So, the fundamental features of Husserl's phenomenology is its insistence on seeing consciousness in its totality, on letting all the rich givenness of the self's experiences to come to view. Go back to the things themselves. Okay. For phenomenology, consciousness is always consciousness of something. In other words, there is always an object of consciousness, and that is the intentional object. The intentional object of consciousness. Okay? So, initially, what consciousness does is to let the object present itself. Okay? Epoche, we perform the phenomenological method. We do epoche. Epoche means bracketing, so that the eidos of the object will come out. So, in phenomenology, we let the object present itself. By bracketing all our biases and prejudices, we let the object present itself. Okay? Letting things be. Okay? Heidegger has a very nice analysis of this kind of phenomenology. Trace that back to the Greeks. Phenomenon, to let the object present itself. Okay? So we allow the object to present itself. Let the being or let the object present itself. That's very nice. But later on, Husserl will add that in perceiving the consciousness, we don't just let the being, the object, present itself. Okay? The mind now imposes something on the object. Consciousness now constitutes the object. Now, by saying that consciousness constitutes the object, we are no longer allowing the object to present itself. We are now owning the object and now try to color the object the way we look at it. Okay? So it's no longer just the eidos, it's now consciousness constituting the object. Okay? So it's now consciousness imposing something on the object. Try to understand the object. Okay? I don't know if that's similar to what Kant would say, well, the mind imposes, there are already categories in the mind, and by way of these categories, sense data that we receive are structured by the mind. Right? So, for Wojtyla, that's the danger in doing that, because instead of allowing the object to present itself, we now constitute the object, or the consciousness constitute the object. So, now going back to the intentional object, this object, according to Wojtyla, must be understood as transcendent to consciousness. This object must be understood as transcendent to consciousness. Meaning, it is separate from consciousness. The object is separate from consciousness. This means that the object of consciousness is always separate from consciousness. It is always separate from consciousness. So if I'm conscious of this, if this laptop is my object, then it is transcendent from my consciousness. In phenomenology, I would just allow this laptop to present itself. What Heidegger would call Gelassenheit, letting things be. No? So we don't impose something on the object. We let the object shows itself from its very self. That's what Heidegger meant by phenomenology. It's actually a different interpretation of phenomenology, different from Husserl. Okay? And of course, those of you who know the story between Heidegger and Husserl, that will be the start of their falling apart. Okay? Anyway, so with the affirmation of the intentional and transcendent character of the cognized objects, the danger of subjectivism is avoided. Okay? What is subjectivism? That when the danger of subjectivism is to think of consciousness as something that constitutes its object. It imposes something on the object of the intentional object. Okay? It's like this, and I remember the example of Dr. Lee in this case. So, by bracketing, we understand the essence of something. Let's, for example, love. We have our biases of love. Okay? Prejudices about love. So, in phenomenology, in the phenomenological method, what we do is to bracket those biases. Suspend what the prejudice about love, so that the angels of love will eventually come out. Love as this is love. But eventually, consciousness will also have its own interpretation of my own loving. My own loving. So that means consciousness now interprets loving from its own perspective. Okay? It imposes something on the object. So, when we say my own loving, it means that loving is no longer a transcendent intentional object. Okay? And that's the danger of subjectivism, because the cognized objects now is constituted by consciousness. And that kind of subjectivism will now eventually lead to relativism. Because my loving will be different from your loving, his loving, and now you can no longer understand what is the very essence of love. Okay? Now that's the danger for Wojtyla, that's the danger of subjectivism. Because although there is an ethos of love, and we can actually have our own understanding, lived experiences of loving, but now you have absolutized consciousness into constituting its own object. Okay? So, by understanding consciousness back to its original interpretation that the object of consciousness is always intentional and it's always transcendent, that consciousness cannot, it cannot constitute its own object because the object is separate. Therefore, Wojtyla, he avoids the danger of subjectivism. Right? So now, Wojtyla blends the basic principle with the phenomenological approach and is able to steer his investigation about the human person out of the dangers of subjectivism and improve on the limitations of objectivism. So Wojtyla adopts his investigation of the human person, adopts in his investigation of the human person a realist phenomenology. I don't know where I get the term realist phenomenology. I was trying to review my sources where I get that. Maybe it's just a construction because Thomism is a realism and he's trying to blend Thomism with phenomenology. Somehow I came up with that kind of whether a realist phenomenology, if there's such a thing.
Empirical terminology.
No, it's not really an empirical, it's more, it's real. I think I use the term real to distinguish that from the idealist tradition of phenomenology. Yeah, something like that. It's a kind of phenomenology that avoids the pitfalls or the excesses of a transcendental phenomenology. So the term realist. Because in reality, really the consciousness will always have to be separated, transcend. Meaning transcendence meaning separate from the object that is being cognized. So it is a phenomenology that does not construct or constitute everything out of an absolute and freestanding consciousness. Freestanding because it's already outside the mind, no? Having constituted consciousness as a separate entity. But that discovers in consciousness or conscious experience the objective reality of real things and real people. Real things and real people. Questions? Yes?
Doc, if the consciousness is mistaken?
What if the
Consciousness is mistaken.
and go ahead.
Since the consciousness is the one that perceives, right? The object. What if it is mistaken in the sense like, sorry, I'm going back to my issue on the LGBT concept. But if it is mistaken in the first place in perceiving the object, let's go with the first object that is most proximate, the body. It is mistaken in its concepts, like it thinks this is what I am, but the body is presenting itself to him or her in another sense.
Well, that question actually supports the position of Wojtyla that you cannot absolutize consciousness. Because consciousness, let's start from the idea that consciousness is always intentional. It is always consciousness of something. So that something is the recognized object. And it is always separated from consciousness. So, assuming that the consciousness is wrong in its awareness, in its perception of the object, then it's wrong, but it does not change the object altogether. You still have the object separate from you. Okay? So therefore, it is the task of consciousness to really bracket all these prejudices so that the real object will come out. Because the object has its own objective status separate from consciousness. It's the danger of subjectivism is when the consciousness imposes itself on the object, so that the object is no longer what the object is. It is not an object constituted by consciousness. And that's the danger of subjectivism. So, look for example about gender or sexuality. There is an objective nature of sexuality and gender. Now, what happens to subjectivism? Now, this subject who think that it can reconstitute the object will now think of sexuality as, well, it's a different kind of sexuality. I can constitute my own sexuality. And that's the nature of subjectivism. So your question about, what about if consciousness is wrong in its perception of the object? Well, it could really be wrong. That's why it cannot absolutize itself. See? There's always an objective basis of everything that we know. Sige, kasi mo na. Sige,
The next slide. I'm just going to take a follow-up. How then was the consciousness mistaken?
How then?
If the consciousness was mistaken in the first place, what caused it to be mistaken?
Okay. Wojtyla talks about the emotionalization of consciousness. And what is that? When consciousness is influenced by the emotions, our perception can be colored by our emotions, especially when we are emotionally attached to the cognized object. Then emotions can influence our perception. So, for example, you are looking at this person and you are so in love with that person. Person is ugly, but you say, that's pretty. She is pretty or beautiful. Precisely because of the influence of the emotions. And that's one danger of allowing our emotions. Of course, Wojtyla recognized the value of emotions, but that's the danger again of absolutizing emotions. When we think that emotions is always right. And therefore, for Wojtyla, while emotion is important because it allows us to recognize initially the value of an object because we are attracted to the value. But it has to be guided and governed by the will, by reason. Because it is reason that recognizes the truth of the value that you feel. Because the emotions will always feel something good about the object, but the question is the value real or truth? Yes? Any question?
Will you said a little bit already about it. So, can we say that the cognized object has a truth in itself or a value in itself that
Yes.
the will must that the consciousness must submit or respond?
Yeah, it has an objective value or it has an objective nature or essence that consciousness must recognize. Of course, that objective value or that objective truth or nature of the object will never be revealed to the person if consciousness has all the biases and prejudices. And that's why it's important for Wojtyla, following of course the phenomenological method, that we bracket all our biases and prejudices. Of course, Heidegger has something to say to that, because for Heidegger, it's impossible to bracket our biases and prejudices. Because we are docile, we are thrown into the world. How can you take out yourself? Because Husserl was talking about there is that dimension where we are totally detached from the phenomenal world that we are in that. I forgot the exact term. It's a dimension we're totally detached from all these biases, and we can really see the egos, meaning the form, the essence. And that's where the egos, the objective nature of the cognized object will reveal itself. Of course, Heidegger said, is that even possible? That's not possible. That's impossible because that's our baggage. All our biases and prejudices are always there. Maybe at some point we can probably stop or suspend it. We cannot totally suspend that. Yes.
Maybe my understanding of Husserl is not that exact. As I see it, the epoche or the reduction method used by Husserl is a kind of method that connects the object and the consciousness.
Okay.
It's like through bracketing, I become immediately face to face with the egos,
Yes.
because I already bracketed away all those distancing us, all those prejudices or presupposition that distances the idols and its consciousness, such that I am now immediately faced with this, and I began to describe
Yeah.
the way I see.
Yeah.
Yet, if John Paul II says the object is always transcendent, then where comes the experience? Where comes the consciousness of the object? If it is always transcendent away from consciousness, how can I really then be conscious of it if it is transcendent?
No, transcendence is not total separation. Transcendence simply means that there's always a distance between the cognizing, the consciousness, and the cognized object. That the object does not really become part of the subject. There's always that distance. Like for example, in Aquinas, in knowledge, there's always the identity and distinction. Distinction in the sense that no matter how, in the process of cognition, or in this case, in the process of consciousness, the object always appears to be separate from the consciousness. But at the same time, there is an identity because, and that allows the connection, because the object presents itself to the cognizing subject. So it's two-way. There's always that separation or distinction. At the same time, an identity.
Can we say that, in fact, for example, the transcendence there does not mean distance. Rather, it means a kind of irreducibility of the objective, let's say, stanza, or the objectiveness of the object. It only means it cannot be reduced to the subject. Rather, it is still connected. Otherwise, there's no consciousness.
Oh yes.
So it is connected yet irreducible to the subject.
Okay, you can say it. You can put it that way. All right. What happened? It's low back. Ilang minutes? Ano oras na ba? Ba't na low back? Mag-aalas 9 na? 8 what? 8 o'clock. Those of you who want to see a break,
Ha? Hindi ko lang maborrow.
Bakit?
Nasa ikaw po eh.
Oh, I have my, yeah. Sige. I'll remind mo ako next ano.
Sige, email ka.
So wala, pero online, meron online.
Meron po ito. Kasi ang problema ko po, pag sinay, if ever po, hindi siya yung, walang, inadami ko lang po parang word file ng po yung translation.
Pero it's a full book.
Kaso ano po, baka yung pagination ng totoong libro po.
Ah, I see. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Sige. Sige, sige.
You already presuppose there is a unity. So practically, you reduce it to a relationship and you describe it.
The was actually influenced by the Thomas. So he's still known in the way. Yeah, Brentano is the Thomas. He was playing his first teacher was Brentano. So this period even with the Bradley and then what they call this. The second part is to constitute, meaning if I remove this, it's like abstractions. It's actually abstractions. How do you understand eidos? The eidos would be the essence. And how do you know if this is now the essence? I remove this quality. If the object changes, then that's essential. If it does not change, then that is, if it changes, then that is essential. If it does not change, then it's not essential. It's similar to the abstraction of a point, because that's actually coming from Brentano. That's you read Husserl and you understand Aquinas. He's just trying to explain something in a different language, but the main idea is common because of Brentano. The object is the one that is bracketed by the subject. So but the one that is
the practicing, yeah, that's for example, that's one understanding of practicing. Or the other understanding of practicing is precisely practicing by this condition. Such a way that in the end, the last receiver is consciousness. And it is immediately consciousness of the next. So it is a practically both ways. But how to understand is what
what I understand, it comes from the time in bracket the swapping of the subject are accidents.
We have to bracket the accidents so that the essence, the eidos will come out.
So what remains is the substance, is it eval accidents?
Yes.
Yeah, that's the quality to be assigned to it.
That's Brentano, and you can place that back to Aquinas.
And what remains also is your quantity, so the quantity in you and that
another thing is always will use this existing thing into a philosophy.
Yeah.
That's another otherwise, you are still with let's say Einstein. It exists. It exists. Before you say it, practically. So that's the point of it. Before you say it exists, you practice.
Because it is very description.
All right, can we? Okay, so let's discuss the irreducibility of the human person. So, the irreducible is that, for Wojtyla, is that which is primordially or essentially human. Primordially and essentially human. And this constitutes the entire originality of man in the world. So man cannot be reduced to any, in the cosmological level, he cannot be considered as just one of the many objects in the natural world. So, the problem of subjectivity goes beyond the metaphysical, for the metaphysical does not really explain man's uniqueness and originality in the world. No? Because if we only dwell on metaphysics, what metaphysics will tell us is what is common. Okay? What is common, what is the essential nature of being human. It does not point to what is unique in every human being. Because little by little, Wojtyla will introduce the concept of the concrete I, the concrete ego. So while there is the substance ego that is common to all of us, we always exist concretely, and by concrete meaning we are always unique from every other human being. That uniqueness is what is irreducible in the human person. So, the issue is not just the metaphysical objectification of the human being as an acting subject, or the agent of acts, but the revelation of the person as a subject experiencing its acts and inner happenings, and with them its own subjectivity. That it simply means that the idea is not just to focus on the subject, but we also have to focus on how can we reveal the person as a subject that experiences its own act. Okay? So how do we reveal the person as a unique person? And of course, the general answer by Wojtyla is by looking into his own actions. Okay? Operation follows essence. Okay? So the conception of man as belonging to the genre of animal simply makes man as one of the objects of the world, and fails to grasp man as a personal subject. And that's the limitation of a metaphysical anthropology, because it will not reach the personal. It will always dwell on the ontological, on the metaphysical. Okay? So, hence, such understanding is only at the cosmological level. So, for Wojtyla, the metaphysical understanding of man is just on the cosmological. The metaphysical understanding is actually what reduces man to the cosmological. So we have, while it's important to recognize that, but that is not enough. And that's the limitation of that kind of anthropology that is limited by metaphysics. Because it will not point to the personal. It will remain at the cosmological level. Man's subjectivity signifies man's irreducibility, and experience of man cannot be exhausted by cosmological reduction. It is the whole being of man, not just his rationality, which is original and irreducible. Even the animality of man expresses the humanity of the whole, and is not identical with the animality of the animals. So, assuming that man is animal, as according to Aristotle, but that animality is different from the animality of all the animals. Okay? We may have the same bodily function as the animals, and that's the reason why Aristotle considers us as one of the animals. But our biological functions are definitely different from the animals. So man is given to us not only as a being specifically defined, but as a concrete I, a subject living himself. So now he introduces as a subject that lives himself. And of course, again, later, the notion of lived experience. So he said, the human being is given to us not merely as a being defined according to species, but as a concrete self, a self-experiencing subject. Our own subjective being and the existence proper to it, that is a suppositum, appear to us in experience precisely as a self-experiencing subject. So such type of understanding is referred to by Wojtyla as personalistic, for it focuses on the personal, the inner aspect of the human being that is irreducible. Such understanding of the being, of the human being, is not the antinomy of the cosmological type, but its complement. So again, he's not trying to put the two positions, opposite or contradictory to each other. It's just saying that this one is correct, but it has its own limitation, and therefore we have to move or add this idea to complement. So the two traditions for Wojtyla, the two understanding of man, the metaphysical/cosmological and the personal/experiential, they complement each other. Okay. So they are not diametrically opposed, and that one is not a negation of the other, or that we can have a complete picture of nature of human being by simply relying on either of them. The point is that we have to put them side by side and put them together. However, when thinking about the human being, both in theory and practice, we always leave a greater space, the upper hand, to the irreducible. And this is where he sides with the other tradition that yes, they complement each other. The metaphysical/cosmological complements with the personal/experiential. But for him, in theory and practice, we have to give more importance to the irreducible, or to the personal/experiential. Okay? Why? Well, because that's what we encounter. That's what we relate to. I mean, we don't relate or encounter a metaphysical subject. We encounter a person, not the genus and species thing. No? We don't talk to a rational animal. Of course, the person is a rational animal, but it's not the rational animal that we encounter. We talk to the person himself, the concrete subject. So there's a need to understand the mode of being which is proper to man. And that mode is personal. Because for Wojtyla, the person is not simply a sample of nature. Okay? So the person is not an individualized humanness. It actually consists rather in the mode of individual being that pertains to mankind alone. This mode of being stems from the fact that the peculiar type of being proper to mankind is personal. Okay, now let's go to, I think this is now the last topic for this part, lived experience. So to understand man as unique and unrepeatable subject, Wojtyla introduces another category of experience which is different from the metaphysical interpretation of Aristotle and that of the empiricists. And this is the notion of lived experience. Of course, we use experience in Aristotle and in the empiricist tradition. And by experience we mean sense experience. Experience by way of the senses. But the notion of experience in phenomenology is different from the notion of experience in empiricism and in Aristotle and in Aquinas. Okay? Where experience is understood in the context of sense perception. In modern empiricism, to be experienced is to be perceived by the senses. So objects are known to the mind because of sense experience or sense perception. And similarly, Aristotle expresses the same notion of sense perception when Aristotle said that all knowledge starts from sense perception, nothing in the mind that has not been through the senses. But this is an epistemological interpretation of sense experience. In other words, the empiricists and Aristotle and Aquinas use experience to explain epistemology or to explain our cognition. Okay, so the experience that the empiricists and Aristotle and Aquinas are talking about is an epistemological category. It is an epistemological idea. It's to explain knowledge. But the lived experience introduced by the existentialists and the phenomenologists is different because it emphasizes the fact that experience is not just an epistemological but an anthropological category, meaning it explains what and how man is. Okay? And suppose, for example, it's like this, and this is how I explain this to my non-philosophy students. What's the difference between lived experience and lived experience? Suppose you have two persons, one is a tourist and the other one is a very religious person, a Catholic, for example. They both enter the church. So the tourist will probably look at the beautiful painting and probably, will appreciate the beauty, of the altar, and he will experience, the colors, the design, etc., etc. What about the Catholic? He will enter the church, and he will experience not the colors, but God. He will experience the divine. Right? The tourist will have a different experience. He will rely on his sense experience. Or probably, he can also rely on his lived experience, but it will be a lived experience that's different from the believer, from the Catholic. Sense perception, they're going to have the same experience because they're going to see the same colors, the same design, etc., etc. They're going to have different lived experiences because that lived experience is personal. So if you are a believer, if you're a Catholic, you're going to have a different experience of the altar or of the church. As a tourist, you're going to have a different lived experience. So it's an anthropological, it reveals the very subjectivity of the person. Person is not just a sensing or perceiving subject, he is an experiencing subject. He's not just any ordinary kind of subject, rather a subject who exists and acts, and his actions is not just kind of acts that is observed from the outside, his actions emanate from within. And therefore, these are not just observed from the outside, they originate from the person's inner core, so to speak. In other words, that's my experience. The Catholic, the believer, will have its own personal experience with God in that church. Another person will have a different lived experience entering a church. Okay? So, man's subjectivity is revealed by his own activity, not only to others, but more importantly to himself. Hence, his experience is not just some kind of experience that can be observed by others and can be categorized and reduced to bits of data and information. His experience is his own experience. His activity is his own activity. It is an experience lived through. That's why I call it a lived experience. An experience lived through. So it is a lived experience, or this lived experience activity that reveals man as a specific subject. So we're not just talking of man in general, but man as concrete, unique, specific subject. And what differentiates us from other human beings like us? Because of our lived experiences. Right? Oh, we can be all teachers, but our lived experience of teachers are different. We can all be like sons and brothers, but our lived experiences as sons and brothers are different. And that's the basis of our irreducibility, of our uniqueness. So since this subjectivity is personal, any action that originates from such subjectivity is also personal, the personalistic value. Person then is a subject living through his own deeds and experiences, which cannot be reduced to any category. So, since it is important to understand the human being as a unique and unrepeatable person, particularly in terms of the entire dynamism of action and inner happening proper to the human being, or personal subjectivity of the human being, then the category of lived experience takes on greater importance. And of course, this lived experience is not something unique to Wojtyla because he actually got that from the phenomenologists and the existentialists. So here you see from the Thomistic tradition, Wojtyla transitioning to the existential and phenomenological tradition. That's why we always say that he was able to blend the two quite well, into his own philosophy. So the human person is unrepeatable and unique, and we know this precisely because he lives his own experience. Okay. Now, the human person revealed to others and to himself by his own living experience, not only as an individual but as a person. And such subjectivity is characterized by three basic notions. First, that the person is conscious of itself or himself. He is a conscious subject and his actions are conscious action. Second, that the person determines, possesses, and governs himself. And lastly, that by performing conscious actions, man or the person fulfills himself. And this is a long topic, the experience of man. What time is it? 8:30, 8:22. I think I can still finish this. Kaya pa? Yes, all right. So, now, what is this experience of man? It's actually, in an answer, it means that the man or the person appears to be both the subject and the object. Meaning, it is man's experience of himself. No? When I was reading the active person, I encountered this, the experience of man. What is this experience of man? It's very simple actually when you understand. It's man's experience of himself. Man having a cognitive relation with himself. By cognitive relation, it means that man appears to himself as an object. It's self-knowledge. Okay? It is self-knowledge. So, it is nothing, not different from what Descartes did in his meditations. He's thinking about himself. I'm sitting in this fire and this is what I'm thinking about. Am I dreaming? I am just being raped by a malicious demon, etc., etc. So it's looking into his own thoughts and so on. But in this case, it's man looking into his own self, establishing a cognitive relation with himself. So, in such experience, it is man who experiences, and it is also him who is experienced. So man, at the same time, becomes the knower and the known. Right? The cognizer and the cognized object. The subject and the object. So, it is man's experience himself. In psychology, there is a method called introspection. It is looking into his own self, one's thought and intention. So, according to Wojtyla, this experience which man has of himself is the richest and apparently the most complex of all experiences accessible to him. Why? Because he can experience other things, and these things are external or outside of him, separate from him. But in the experience of man, the object of that experience is himself, his own actions, and his own thoughts. That's why for him, it's the most complex and the most rich of all experiences, because it gives man information, data about himself. So, in this experience, man establishes a cognitive relation with himself. He becomes face-to-face with himself. And from this experience, man appears both as a subject of experiences and the object that is experienced. So, although at the level of consciousness, this stops from time to time, because of course, it's impossible that you're always conscious of yourself. That we always establish that maybe in your prayers, if you are in the prayer room, then probably you can have that cognitive, or you are alone, you have nothing to do, and try to do some introspection habits, but it can stop. So it can always be reestablished. And since man is always in his own company, it is in a way continuing. He clarified that although every experience is unique and unrepeatable moment, but because the object of that experience is man, who emerges from all these moments, then we can rightly call it the experience of man. And the experience of man is not limited only to man's ego or self. Other men, aside from man's ego, can also be the object of one's experience. And Wojtyla points out that the experience of man is composed of his experience of himself and of all other men whose position in relation to the subject is that of the object of experience. That is to say, those who are in direct cognitive relation to the subject. So for example, while I'm lecturing, I am conscious of myself, but at the same time, I am also conscious of the other persons or other objects that are related to me. So if I am conscious of my own teaching, then of my lecture, then I am not only conscious of myself, but also the people who are listening. Okay? So that gives me also information about the persons or objects that are related to me or related to the person. So if you see yourself as an object and you see yourself as a father or a daughter or a son, then the other people are brought into the scope of your experience. So the experience of man then has two possible objects: the ego or the self, and other men or fellow men. And this is how he connects subjectivity with intersubjectivity. Okay? So the experience of man allows us to have a relationship with ourselves and at the same time have a relationship with other ego or other men, our fellow men. And that relationship with other men is already in the area of intersubjectivity. So you see, the experience of man is a very rich experience, because it's not only limited to the experience of the self of himself, it extends to the experience of the self with other fellow human beings.
How is this?
How?
Is it, the experience of me, myself, and from where does it come that I am experiencing also all of others? Of course, if I experience myself as a relational, like for example, I experience myself as a student, immediately I include the professor.
Yeah.
That's where it comes. But if you purely think of the experience of the self, pure in itself, then where comes the intersubject?
Well, precisely as you said, when you focus on yourself, you cannot exclude the fact that the self is also connected to some other. It brings to your attention the other people that are related to you. In this case, you see yourself not as an individual, separate self-contained self, because that self is also connected to some other selves.
But is it me, myself, make myself a student, or the fact that I'm a student, in fact, is constituted by the professor? Or like, what I mean is, while I'm experiencing myself, without experiencing myself as such, then there's no intersubjectivity. But only when I experience myself as a student, a husband, or a child.
Well, when you say as such and such, as what? Not just by of course.
As a student, then intersubjectivity comes in.
Yes.
Automatically. But how about I experience myself. Not, I don't go into the second step as a student. I don't go to that step because
Okay, fine. But you can do that. But Wojtyla says that, well, it's not only limited to that. Because as you have said, I can also look at myself as a student.
yeah. What I mean is that fact added to me without my own initiative creating, or is simply my own adding to myself? But where comes this identity as a student or as a husband?
Okay.
Is it from me myself, or is it simply a given? I just
It's a given.
I just did not see it.
It's a given because there is no self that is separated from other self. The world for Wojtyla is a social world. When you are born, you cannot but choose. You are born to parents, and therefore, by the very fact that you are born, you are already subjective.
So
So it's always given.
the experience of me myself is only partial, if pure in itself.
Okay.
Only that I am not yet aware that me myself is a self as a son or as a daughter.
Oh yes. At some point, you may not be aware that you are a son to parents, but that's always given.
So the
So in this
intersubjectivity is a given fact. It's not the established fact.
It's a given fact. Sociality is a given fact. Because nobody comes to this world without having to come from parents in the first place. And then you have to live in a family, and then live in a society, a community, in school, etc., etc. So it's a fact of existence. Society is a fact of existence. And then here you are, product of that society. When you look into yourself, so you don't just recognize yourself as an isolated subject, you also recognize the fact that I come from my parents, I go to school, I have my parishioners, I have my classmates, etc., etc. So now the other people comes to the scope of your self-cognition.
So the subjectivity itself is at the same time intersubjective.
Oh yes. Although of course you may discover that later in your life, but it's always part of human existence. That,
But according to our lived experience, the intersubjectivity is something added also. Like before I am not a priest, but now I am a priest, I have parishioners. It is something added. It is not automatically there.
Okay, I get your point. There are some aspects of our intersubjectivity that are added into our own subjectivity because we practice in our lives. But you see, that something added is due to the fact that the world is social. By social meaning the world is inhabited by other people. And I don't know what better way to put this.
So you mean this sociality as intersubjective is something underlying every subjectivity?
Oh yes.
So much so that it can be realized in this form or that form.
Yes.
Okay.
And some of the
And that sociality is a given.
it's a given.
It's to be realized in different.
Yes. And given, and we can add to that subject, to that sociality by becoming this person and that person. By becoming a priest, then you add to that.
You specify.
Yeah, yes. But the sociality is always there. The people you associate with will come later. It is added. Okay? So when I get married, my sociality expands because I have my wife, and then the children comes, and then the sociality expands. But the sociality is given. It's a given fact.
Because in Husserl, this is a very difficult subject. where arise this intersubjectivity?
Oh.
Is it just what the second is given?
Well, there are many different ways of interpreting intersubjectivity. Okay. But the thing is that, I don't know, maybe some philosophers are, what do you call this? They're theorizing so much that they forgot about the real, the practical things. How would it be difficult for Husserl to think where the subjectivity comes from? And he must have looked. The first thing that he should ask is, where did I come from? And the most obvious answer for any person is, and some people will say, pilosopo ka, no? Pag tinanong ka, saan ka galing? Sa nanay ko. Where did you come from? From my mother. And the basic answer coming from mother establishes the very social and the subjective nature of human existence, right? Some philosophers are philosophizing too much that they forgot about that there is a canal in front of them, like what happened to Thales. See, they are speculating so much and they've forgotten the practical things. Okay? Anyway, well, so the moral lesson, don't philosophize too much. Might fall into it is. So, or you may be hit by a car. So when you go home, forget about philosophy, mind the cars. Okay? Never mind Wojtyla. Alright, so where are we now? So the other stuff, one difference is in terms of directness and immediacy. We're talking now of the experience of the self, of his ego, and another ego. Okay? So, the difference is in terms of directness and immediacy. I experience myself directly and immediately, but I do not have the same directness and immediacy in the case of another self. Okay? I directly experience my own emotions and feelings, but I experience the feelings and emotions of other only indirectly. Nevertheless, every human person has an experience of humanity as it is manifested in his own, and an experience of himself which derives from the reflection of his own being and acting among other men. Each one then has also an immediate or experience of the other man. So if my friend will have his own experience of himself and me as a friend. So I will appear to him as another ego. He will appear to me as another ego. So I have my own experience of myself, at the same time an experience of another self, and the other self will have an experience of its own self and the experience of another self, like in the case of me as his friend. So the experience of the other man is differentiated further into experiences of his own interior reaction, communicated through language, and experiences of those external actions which we are able to notice directly. So there exists, therefore, in oneself and in others, the sphere of internal experience and the sphere of external experience. Internal experience pertaining to the self and external experience pertaining to the things outside. There also exists through language a relatively communicability of the experience of the other. The experience of the other can be an object of one's cognitive act or emotional act, without which one can never properly live the experience of the other man. And if you're going to continue this cognitive act or emotional act, well, you can connect that to the empathy or sympathy that other philosophers like Einstein and Max Scheler talk about. So there is a distinction between other men as objects of experience and myself as the object of my experience. In one of them, we would have the experience only of man as the other, and in the other only as this person. So it is, however, impossible to deny that in both cases we are dealing with a human being. The two experiences differ, but they are not separable. Because my experience of myself is different from my experience of other persons. but they are not separable because they are all they're connected. The disparity occurs when I am given to myself as my own ego, and thus more directly and differently than other men who is not myself. Even when we assume the closest possible relation to another man, being the difference will always remain. Sometimes we may be close to another person and we may actually find easier to know and comprehend what is there in him or what he actually is. But this cannot be equivalent to having an experience. Because to have an experience will always be your own personal experience of the self. Even if somebody tells you about his experience, well, he can communicate his experience to you, but you can never have an experience of his own experience. You can have a similar experience, but you can never. This is how Wojtyla puts it. Nobody can will for you. Nobody can love for you. You may share the ability to will, but the very willing, the having of experience of willing can never be transferred. Okay? It can never be transferred. So nobody can will for you, nobody can decide for you. People may also make a similar decision, but he will never have the same experience as when you make that decision. So for example, those who become priests, they made a decision to be ordained, but they will never have the same experience, meaning the experience can never be transferred to anyone. Okay? So that's why, again, another aspect of the irreducibility of the person. So, everyone is the object of his own unique experience, and no external relation to any other human being can take the place of the experiential relation that the subject has to himself. So for all the richness of the idea of sympathy or empathy, it can never come close to the experience of the self of himself. So when somebody dies, for example, your friends will come, etc., will condole with you and probably will sympathize with you, but they will never experience the loss that you feel with the loss of a loved one. So that's the idea of Wojtyla. This brings us to the inner and outer aspects of experience of man. The inner experience is exclusive to the ego or to the self himself. And this is possible only in relation of man to himself. All other men are excluded from this experience. I alone have a direct experience of myself. I alone know how exactly I feel and how exactly I think. The other can only have an outer or external experience. So the experience of the self with other men or ego is called outer experience. Experientially, the ego is the inner man, and it differs from the outer man, who is always other than the self. It is always the self who has an experience of himself. Others at one point may have access or know someone's interior or inner self, but they can never have an experience of someone's self. So, they may have an idea of what you're going through, but they can never go through what you go through. In that sense. Of course, they may have a similar experience, but that will be a different experience, and you can never have that experience the same as his experience. So that's the point of Wojtyla. I think that's about it. So, and then the other ones are just further explanation of this concept. So inner experience of man and the outer experience of other men. It's just that he did not develop really this into he could have developed this into an idea of sympathy or empathy. I don't know, maybe there are hidden writings about this, but you can go to some other philosophers like Einstein, who has a more robust and more developed idea of empathy or the sympathy of Max Scheler. But these are very, substantial, very similar ideas or thoughts of Wojtyla on the experience of self and other self, external experience and internal experience. Okay? So I'll stop there. Have any questions? Yes?
Actually, I'm going to that aspect of empathy. I'm thinking about would there be any application of Wojtyla's philosophy? I'm thinking, for example, because the basic notions of Wojtyla, he says that a person is someone who is conscious. Someone is conscious that he is acting, and someone who can will consciously of his actions. What if a person is in a state of coma, and we don't know what his inner experiences are at that moment, and then the people around him would be the ones to decide either to pull the plug or to feed him. So we don't know if he wants to die or if he wants to continue living. So how do we know that we are empathizing with his inner experience?
That's a very, very difficult question. It's a very difficult question, and I remember my wife telling me to watch this. I think it's Korean novella or something, because it was the story of a man, of a doctor who was in prison. So he's a doctor in prison, and when I asked why is he in prison, well, she tells me the story that the doctor cannot stand the feeling that he has a patient, a boy, who is suffering intensely, and he cannot bear to see the boy suffering. So what he did was to remove the life support system. The family wanted of course, they wanted the boy to live. They don't want him to die. But the doctor cannot, he cannot stand. He knows how that the boy is suffering, and therefore he pulled up the support system, and for that he was accused by the parents, and that's the reason why he went to prison. So you see, it's a very complicated situation. You don't really know how the person feels. And in that case, maybe you can just rely on. So these are different feelings, because the feeling of the doctor is that he pitied the boy, but apparently the family has a different feeling for the boy, that they want him to live. So what is more painful? What is more painful now? The pain of witnessing somebody suffer, or the pain of somebody going? So I don't know how to answer that. No? See, we cannot really know what the other person is feeling, because if he's really sick and he's in a coma. But there are rules or laws that we follow with regards to this, and that's probably the reason why he was in prison, because the doctor did not follow the law. What he followed, he followed the law of his heart. But of course, that law will not stand in court. No? It's a different court altogether. So that's a very difficult, and I think that's the most difficult question. If you are a doctor, that's the most difficult thing. Okay? That's why some doctors, they have this, what do you call this, not to revive. It's a waiver not to resuscitate, something like that. So the parents or the family agree that will no longer be revived, or the family will agree that you can. But the complicated thing is that he did not allow the boy to die naturally or just expire, wait for him to expire. actually pulled the support system because he pitied the patient. So it's really very complicated. Yes?
Sorry, just to finish with the decision. There was a case, and we know that everyone has their special experience, but there was a case that a man, when he was a boy, was traumatized, and then for many years, the family just gave the support, life support and everything. When he was about 20, he woke up. And according to his lived experience, according to the story, because we cannot really, as you say, we cannot experience what he experienced, he said he was conscious all the time. Here's what the parents were saying and everything that was going around. But he cannot see, of course, because he was comatose. And he heard his mother tell him, why won't you just die? And when he became conscious, after he woke up after all those years, he told his mother that he was conscious when she was telling that to him. And of course, the mother did not. We know it would hurt the feeling of the mother. But the main point here is that I think with that little, of course, we do not put the generalization that everyone who is traumatized will have that same experience. But I think with that example, yeah, the decision making of that same person is still there. He's still active in a sense. At least in that little specific example of that person. So no matter how good we are, we cannot really decide for that person because that person still has his own say on those things.
But probably you can decide, you can look at the facial expression. You may be conscious or not conscious, and that's something we don't know. But the facial expression of the patient, because a person in pain cannot really hide. I remember my uncle, he had cancer, lung cancer, and during the last days of his life, because he can no longer move, he was given this painkiller. If he's not injected with the painkiller, he can no longer talk. So he will just tear up. Tears will just flow out of his eyes, and you know how you can feel. Of course, you don't really know the extent, the intensity of the pain, but it's very painful because he will just tears will just come out of his eyes, and he can no longer complain because he's so weak to say anything. So he will just it's very painful. How painful it is, we don't know, because maybe it's so intense that that is a strong man. I know him to be very strong, but during the last days, because of the pain, without the painkillers, he will just cry out of pain. So maybe that's the experience of the doctor that I'm talking about. If you have that, if there is the physical manifestations of pain, suffering, then you are put into that situation whether to pull or not to pull. to let him live or just pull out the support system. And it's a very tough situation to be in, especially if you are a doctor. Or if you are the parent. If your son is just unconscious and you think he's not feeling anything, then okay, fine. But we can probably continue living, but if you see the pain, no, that's difficult, that's tough. And maybe you are just allowing him to continue living just for the sake that you see him. It's really for you, not for him. So you want him to suffer because you don't want him to go. So which is more painful, letting him go or seeing him